Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Gerardo Poli.
And this, oh, sorry. Okay.
I'm Gerardo Poli.
I'm Hubert Hemstra, and this is the Vet Vault. So, G, how much do you care about, or let me rephrase, how much did you care about compounding before we did this session?
I cared very little for compounding. Literally, I thought that I was my own little alchemist in the pharmacy, mixing up my little potions of crushed tablets with water, thinking that shit's going to work. And it was really quite enlightening, the stuff I learned in this podcast.
Exactly. So the reason we're talking about is last month we were invited to be the facilitators for a panel discussion around the ins and outs of veterinary compounding, including stuff like standards and the rules around it that affects us as vets.
The organizers clearly wanted someone to ask dumb questions that normal vets were too proud to ask. So Hubert was the obvious choice.
I think they also somebody to do a lot of shit talking. And Gerardo delivered. They asked for him and he delivered 100%.
Yes, I do my best. I do my best to deliver. But on the panel, we had Dr. Sue Foster, who is a feline medicine specialist, an adjunct associate professor in small animal medicine at Murdoch University in Western Australia, and a small animal medicine consultant for Vetnostics and ASAP Laboratories. We had Nick Bova from Bova Compounding. I was actually quite surprised to find out that Bova was his last name. Yeah. But anyway, and we had Dr. David Fowler, who is a practice owner from New South Wales. And then there was us. Turns out there is a lot of really important things that we didn't know about having compounded medications for our patients. And probably a lot that you, our listeners, wouldn't know, but should know. So we decided to share it on the podcast.
Now, if you listen to this and you think, hang on a minute, it sounds like this could be sponsored by Bova or something. Well, it wasn't, but it is now. The session was actually hosted by the IVA, which is the Independent Vets of Australia, who kindly agreed to let us use the audio. And they hosted it as an information session for their members. And Nick from Bova was one of the guest panelists. But then, when I was editing this, I thought to myself, hey, I should get Bova to sponsor this episode. So I asked, and they said, yeah, sure. Which means that I now get to tell you that this episode is sponsored by Bova, who are, of course, a standalone compounding facility that is dedicated to compounding exclusively veterinary medications. But you probably already knew that. What you might not know, though, is that they hold themselves to GMP standards, and that is the Good Manufacturing Practices, which is the same internationally accepted standard that registered medicines are made to. Every batch that they make is tested by APVMA GMP licensed facilities using validated methods, and Bova sources their active ingredients only from GMP manufacturers, which means that you'll get no impurities or other surprises in the end product that goes out to your clients and in to your patients. It means that what it says on the bottle is what you get and that it should work the way it's supposed to. So
let's get into the podcast and get back to the panelists.
Enjoy.
Hey team, thank you for having us on board. And I must say that this is Hubert's opportunity to insult me live and recorded.
Thank you so much for having me. I did laugh when you guys contacted me and said, you seem to be pretty good at facilitating conversations. And I said to somebody, I don't know about that. I'm more good at editing audio afterwards. But no, we're thrilled to be here. And please don't let me insult Gerardo alone. Everybody jump in on the chat and insult him all you want. How are we going to run this? We thought that we'll just do it like a podcast. All we like to do on the Vet Vault is have conversations with people who are smarter than us, and it seems to be the case in this room here. I don't know about you guys, but compounding wasn't something I gave a lot of thought to. Back in GP days in Perth, we had a compounding pharmacist just down the road, George, down the road, came over and introduced himself and sold us drugs for cheap, and we didn't ask too many questions. And I'm thinking more and more that maybe we should have asked questions the more I think about this and the more I dig into it. And I think the rest of you, that's why you're all here to hear about this tonight. There's quite a lot to talk about. The first thing I want to ask, can we please just define what exactly compounding is? In preparing for this, I was thinking, I'm not actually even clear what is the difference between a compounder and a normal drug company. Are you like the local meth lab down the road that buys the raw ingredients and makes the active ingredient, or do you just put stuff in different formulations? I know it's maybe a very dumb question, but I actually don't know. So maybe
I feel like I'm a compounder sometimes when I'm crushing up misoprostol into liquid and then trying to determine how many milligrams per 10 mils of misoprostol I made up to try to figure out how I'm going to give like a 10 kilo dog like 5 micrograms per kilo of a potentially kind of like pretty potent medication. So like, is me crushing up stuff in that, like, you know, on the table and scraping it into a thing and mixing and shaking it up, is that a compounding? Is that the process of compounding?
Yeah, I think it is. You're a compounder.
Done. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so I suppose just to define the difference. So if you're talking about licensed products or products that you have on your shelf at, you know, a veterinary clinic, those products have gone through the registration process, which means the regulator, they have assessed things such as safety, efficacy, chemistry, so they understand the stability of the product, etc. And so a package has been put together by the pharmaceutical company, it's been submitted to the regulator, and they've assessed for all of that. And on top of that, the products are made in accordance with GMP, so good manufacturing practice standards, which is an internationally accepted quality standard for how to make medicine. And so when you're talking about compounding products, you're talking about products that are exempt from that registration process, so that haven't been assessed by the APVMA for safety, efficacy, and chemistry, and are not made in Australia, not made according to GMP standards. So I suppose that's the simplest explanation of the differences.
Thank you. My next question is, who exactly can compound? Do you need to be a pharmacist? What are the rules and regulations around who's allowed to sell themselves as a compounder?
Yeah, so any pharmacy or any pharmacist who has got a pharmacy degree is able to put up a sign and become a compounding pharmacy. So there's no actual demonstration of capability requirements for any pharmacist before they're able to say they're able to compound any product class. And just to draw an analogy back to, say, licensed products, when you're talking about GMP manufacturers, so they, for instance, would go to the regulator and say, look, I want to be able to make tablets. And so they would get auditors from the APVMA come out and audit them to make sure their equipment, their facilities, their staff, that everything is capable of making tablets. And then if they want to be able to do liquids, same thing, they get audited for that. And because it's quite complicated, different product classes, especially if you're doing things like sterile and tablets. So you actually get audited to make sure you're capable. However, with pharmacies, they can open the door and they can offer everything from tablets to sterile and everything in between, and not need to demonstrate any capabilities before offering those services.
Because like I Googled it today and I went compounding pharmacies Australia, because I remember ages ago when this is 10 years ago, like the first brochure that came out ever was Bova, right? Now you Google it, it's like 15 different companies, if not more. That's like the first page. And then on that page was how to become a veterinary compounding pharmacist. So I was like, what is there, a course on this now or something? Or is it like an easy thing to get into as a pharmacist?
Yeah, as I said, anyone can do it. Yes, there are extra courses that pharmacists should do. There are extra trainings that they should do. There are things out there to better themselves, but there's no actual requirement from a legal perspective. Anyone can actually do it. Obviously, pharmacists should act professionally and train themselves in the area that they're going to operate, but there's nothing to stop them doing it. And yeah, you're right. I think 15's been generous. I think there's probably several hundred compounders out there at the moment.
That was just on the first page. It's expanded. Like that industry is expanded.
And are they regulated? I'm assuming there's like the equivalent of a vet board or something who checks up on pharmacists, or you know, I'd like to assume that their premises or where they manufacture stuff will get inspected and graded or something. Yes.
I'm not trying to scare everyone, but that's not actually the case. So yes, there are professional practice standards that give guidance to pharmacists on how to compound appropriately. However, these guidelines are not, they're only looked at if there was a complaint, which with GMP manufacturers is obviously very different. They have set routine audits. They're proactively audited before they offer the services and then routinely audited. So it is very different.
So then how do you determine quality then? Or how do you determine quality? As a veterinarian, how do you know what you get is what you asked for?
So from a veterinarian's perspective, the ABA have some pretty good guidelines when it comes to compounding, and they in there have questions on how to vet your compounder. So, ask them all of these types of questions that could, I suppose, instill some confidence. But the issue that I have with that is I do wonder how many veterinarians would actually get on the phone and quiz a pharmacist about their quality standards. And then two, would know enough to know whether the answer they're given was in fact the case, or was that what they're being told is true. And the answer is not a great one until there's third-party external auditing of pharmacies and accreditations of those pharmacies. Then the only really way you're going to know is having a really good relationship with the pharmacy, watching for the product that you're using and seeing how it works. And there isn't any way, the products don't look different, but they will have completely different formulations. They will have completely different sources of actives in them. So yeah, just by speaking to someone or looking at a product, it's very hard to tell.
Nick, in my mind, from like a branding perspective, there's a differentiator between Bloom's the chemist down the road who happens to have a guy who likes a little bit of compounding and someone who's set up their entire business framework to do that. But from a legal standpoint or regulation-wise, there is no difference between the two, except that you guys hold yourselves to perhaps a very high standard where they may not, but that's just because of a specialisation. Am I right about that?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. So in my mind, trust in compounding probably for me comes from experience with therapy and time. But I think, unfortunately, I don't think there's any sort of way around this. We have nothing else to go by, do we? Is there like a machine that you can shove the drugs in and prove that it's got the right concentrate? Can you vet yourselves? And you must do, right?
Yeah. So
take a tablet yourself and see what happens, Dave. That's how it works.
That would be, if I was to give one question to try and help vets, it would be that. It would be asking your compounding pharmacist, are they able to produce a certificate of analysis of an end product? So something that they've actually made, not the starting material, but the finished product. They say there's 100 milligrams of active in this product per mil or per tablet or whatever. Are they able to produce a certificate that shows there is 100 milligrams in that active, in that product? They don't have to be able to do it for every single time they make a product, but do they ever critically assess themselves and test their actual products that they make to know what's in them? So that could be a great question to ask.
Right. So your average retail pharmacy who dabbles in a bit of compounding may be quite unlikely to have a certificate of analysis for something that they make up once in a blue moon, right? Because there'd just be no need or cause to do so.
Yeah, almost certain they won't be able to do that.
Yeah.
David, if I might make a comment there, when I had, trilostane is one of the few things that you can assess to a degree without an independent analysis, because you can actually measure a function test. So it's one of the few drugs that you actually get a look at and go, wow, that's not working, because it's completely different to the last time on the same dose, the owner's the same, just different batches or whatever. And I've gone to chemists that I've been able to recognise, because I deal with such a lot of results that I can start seeing patterns when things are failing, and I can find compounding chemists where there's a problem. And when you go to them, they always ask me where to get their analysis done. I mean, I'm not a chemist, a pharmacist or anything else. And so they have no idea. And half the time I've had to find them a independent laboratory to get their product analysed, which is just extraordinary, really.
And I think with this ACTH stimulation test, I would guess that if you've asked them to look at the trilostane, that you've confirmed in those cases that they're using the Synacthin that comes in the vial, commercial Synacthin, because there's also, is it tetracoxactrin available through compound as sterile for intravenous use?
Well, yes, there have been various compoundings of ACTH over the years. One of them was a spectacular failure, and that was very evident because we got all sorts of flatline results around the country when that product was being sold. So that was quite concerning. That company is no longer here, thank goodness. But we do know that the Bova tetracosaccharin, in our hands independently, no sponsorship from Bova, we actually analysed that and assessed that against Synacthin, and the results were essentially identical. So we're comfortable that unless something goes wrong in transit, which it can as well, that the product that we have checked in different batches from Bova. So certainly with that product, at that time, we were able to validate that, but that would be very uncommon.
Right.
How would that even work? How could you produce something that has almost no effect? Like, you would think it'd be not as good, but not just absolutely terrible. Like, do they even have trilocene in it? I don't know. Nick, where can you screw up in that area, in that space?
Honestly, it's quite difficult to make a product that works. It's quite easy to make one that doesn't.
Okay.
So, I mean, things that can go wrong from start to finish, from sourcing raw materials. So there is a full gambit of raw materials available, from full GMP manufacturers that make highest possible quality and get audited by, independent regulators, down to suppliers of raw materials that don't have a license to do it and never get audited. So compounding pharmacies could source from any of that range, and the price difference is 10, 20-fold, and so is the quality. So that's one place. When it comes to the formula, there's no standardized formulations for this. So the compounding pharmacy comes up with their own, and if they use the wrong vehicle, for instance, they add water to something that breaks down very quickly, by the time it gets to you, it might not have any activity left. Or a recent example, we've been trying to extend the shelf life of one of our equine pastes, and just couldn't get it past a certain time point, and eventually looked at all the incompatibilities and found that one of the ingredients, which was like a gum, a thickening agent, was the actual reason for the active breaking down. I never would have known that unless you'd go and do compatibility testing and work out what it is that's causing these issues. And so there's a lot that goes into making a formulation suitable, making sure that it's stable. Particle size, if you could get a particle size of an active vastly different each time, that's going to massively affect the bioavailability. Then there's obviously the actual making it. You might mix for too long, or you might expose it to too much heat, or package it in something that's exposed to light. But the list goes on. So it's quite difficult to get it right.
So
I feel very not very confident about my mixing misoprostol and water, and now now you were thinking in your head like, oh, that's bad. Don't use that.
And you picked like one of the most obvious ones that you shouldn't be playing with, in terms of...
Dude, I was trying to just give a small dog some misoprostol.
Speak to a compounder.
Nick, so when you said about the paste that you figured out it wasn't lasting beyond a certain point, how do you know? Are you checking the levels of active ingredient or functionality? Are you sending it to Sue to analyze? Or how does a compounder check that what they're doing is working before they sell it to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you need to have validated analytical methods to be able to do that. So which means you have to we work with external third-party labs that are GMP, APVMA accredited labs. Mm-hmm. And so they do the analysis for us. You send them the formula. It takes them several weeks, sometimes months, to come up with what's called a validated analytical method, and they can extract exactly what you want out of it. So you tell them the active, and they be able to extract it. And then you've got a validated method. You can then send them samples, and they can tell you exactly, is the active in there? And you do stability trials. So you get them to take samples at time 0, at 3 months, 6 months, at different storage conditions in the room, exposed to really hot conditions in the fridge, what's called a stability trial. So you have to do those actual assessments with third parties that are accredited.
And is that a good way for us as practitioners to figure out who is doing it right or not? To say, well, have you got that sort of certification of your products for us? Like you said earlier, and can you say, this drug I want to order, when's your most recent independent analysis of your drug for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something, I'm not trying to set up compounders to fail here, because most of them wouldn't have that. But they're the types of things that they should be doing if we do it at Bova every single time we make a particular batch of our most commonly requested products. But obviously there are compounders that are at, smaller size and they can't afford to do that, and that's completely fine, but they should do it, randomly at least. So at least that you've got some confidence that formulation and that staff member who's made it are capable of reproducing consistently. So yeah, I think it is a good question to ask. Have they ever assessed their end products?
Okay.
I don't know if you've already answered this, Nick. I'm not sure you have. I used to notice when we ordered trazodone in for patients that we treated that the expiry date on the packaging was 6 months, and now I'm seeing that it's 12 months away. And also, we do use some compounded trilostane, and it's got a 6 months expiry on it. I've always wondered and never asked whether those expiry dates were just arbitrarily set because they're non-registered products, or whether there was I wonder what's behind that. Is it arbitrary, or is there some science or knowledge to it?
Both. So compounders can refer to journals and published information out there that talks about it. If you put trilostane with a particular oil, you should get a 3-month shelf life, and that's kind of literature-based stability. They need to be really conservative and put short shelf lives. However, you can do your own formal stability trials, which we have done with our trazodone, and have been able to extend our shelf life because we've taken samples at 12-month time point and the activity is still, within what the range that we set, i.e. close to 100%. So there's both. So we do formal stability trials, not on all of our formulations, but on our most common ones, we do it.
So initially, the expiry may be conservatively set based on literature. It's not just randomly set because there's a legal requirement not to have it any longer than X time frame. But then with stability trialing in-house, you might extend it. And you're actually testing the active in the end product at that time point at the end of the expiry, not the therapeutic efficacy so much, but something to do with you're testing a bottle, not an animal, right?
Yeah, so that's when I spoke initially about the 3 things the regulator assesses. One of them is efficacy, the other safety, and the third one's chemistry. So this is just the chemistry component. Is the product still got potency at the end of its shelf life? Yes. And so that's something that there's no requirement to do that. But if the compound is going to put a long shelf life, then they should have done their own formal stability trials to confirm that.
Okay.
I got a question, Nick. You're getting harassed tonight, mate, by the sounds of things. But you talked about your common drugs. Common drugs, you've done quality control, quality assurance, and testing to ensure efficacy and so forth. But what about like small batches of unique drugs, like misoprostol liquid? No, I'm just kidding. That's why I compound that myself, right? But let's say someone asks you for like a really obscure drug or something. How do you know that is what you're sending going to work?
So, I mean, I can answer that from my perspective. So I suppose from Bova's perspective, we covered as many of the aspects of the process from start to finish as possible. The end product testing is going to be missing when it comes to those unique things you don't do very often. But your sourcing of raw materials, your facilities being controlled in terms of counts and microbial contamination, all that type of stuff is controlled. Your staff are trained and validated. The equipment was fit for purpose because you've done tests to make sure it does mix things the correct way. So you can tick a lot of the boxes along the way, but that final check of, yes, this is 100% what I say it is going to be missing with those bespoke lines that aren't made in volume.
Sue, is there a way on your side or on the lab side, let's put it that way, that one could check stuff, functionality, and to rephrase that question, have you come across other issues? You talk about the trilostane, but any other medications that we're measuring drug levels, for example, and from the lab, you see that there are issues there?
Yeah, I guess 2 things there. Obviously, I don't work for an analytical chemical lab, so gotcha. I would have no idea. On the ClinPath side, there's very few things that are tested, and it's really interesting that as veterinarians, we do take stuff on face value. If someone compounds some Flavulox into a liquid for a cat, we just assume it's got the right amount in it. If the cat doesn't get better, we think, oh, well, maybe we've got the wrong bug, but it could well be the drug. Mm-hmm. And there's really no way of checking. There's only just a few things. I mean, obviously, drugs that we can test a blood level, things like phenobarbital or potassium bromide or cyclosporin. There's drugs that we can check blood levels because we would do that in the animal. But the vast majority of compounded drugs, as I see it, there is no way of checking at all unless the animal responds, I suppose, positively and improves. But even then, it could just be coincidence.
Yes. Could be getting better despite what you're giving it.
Yeah, well, we all know that happens.
Yeah. Nick, we had a one of the, not the panelists, we're the panelists, one of the listeners ask a great question. Sally said, are there like a list of 5 questions we can ask our compounder to say, key things that we need to check off on a list of 5 things that the boxes need to be ticked to know that we are using the right compounder?
So, I mean, one of them would be that certificate of analysis thing. The others, do you have a quality management system? If you do sterile, is your facility up to the appropriate standards? Are particles being counted and that it's being made in a sterile environment? I suppose it does come down to the specifics of what you're requesting. But it's very difficult to put it down to 5 questions because quality is such a big thing. We could speak the whole day about quality and still not get very far. So it's hard to break it down. But I think it's just a genuine relationship with your compounder, being able to interact with them and trust them, maybe be able to see the facility. Do they have dedicated compounding suites? I know a lot of compounders have compounding inside their retail business. And, is the product protected from cross-contamination and things like that? Do they ever do testing of their staff to make sure their staff, I know for myself, when we make these batches, even following every single process exactly the same and validated everything along the way, we can still make errors and we still have batches that are discarded. And that's because things can go wrong along the way. And so you need to have a process for critically assessing yourself as a pharmacist, and that's something to potentially ask. Are they assessing their staff? Have they tested their equipment? Is it fit for purpose? You can expose yourself to audits by external auditors to make sure your business is up to standard. Have they ever done that?
Okay, maybe I'll ask the question from a different perspective. Are there like 5 things that should go do red? Okay, this guy is selling you, baby powder in liquid.
Price would be a big one. I know that sounds a little bit self-serving, but the truth is quality and price, they're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And to do high quality compounding is expensive because that means you've got to test your staff. Every time you send off for analytical tests, it's several $100s a sample. You've got to clean your facility daily, weekly, monthly. You need to have external people coming in to do it. That's very expensive. Your equipment needs to be fully validated. That's expensive. So price would stand out as like a warning sign. Willingness to do anything without asking questions, that to me would sound alarm bells. If they're making sterile and don't have a sterile facility or sterile injectables without it, or tablets, complicated product classes like tablets require a really high skill set. And so I'd be looking out for things like that.
Cool. Another one from the listeners, we've got Rebecca saying, would you say it's best to use a pharmacy that's purely compounding rather than both retail and compounding? Like, are there factors there that's going to influence how well they do in the compounding sphere?
I would say absolutely. If you can pick a compounder that fully specializes in compounding, that means they're taking it that means that's their full focus. And if they produce low quality medicine, they're not going to have a business, are they? Because they haven't got the retail business to rely on. So I think that's a great thing to focus on. If you can find a compounder that's just doing compounding, and even better, a compounder that just does veterinary compounding, then you know that they're focusing on you.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a key question then. Nick, I thought both are like standard for something, but now it's your last name. Now I don't answer that question. But why did you get into veterinary compounding?
Okay. The truth is not a very exciting story. I took over my father's retail pharmacy, which was called Bova. And just after I bought it, Chemist Warehouse opened 100 meters from me, and I was in trouble, and I was looking for other ways to make money. And so stumbled across compounding. And in the first instance, we were doing it for humans, and found just no, I suppose, interaction with the prescriber, and they certainly didn't seem appreciative. And then we started doing it for veterinary, and veterinarians were just blown away that they had access to these things that they never had before, and stopped them crushing up misoprostol tablets themselves, and we could do it for them. And it was just really well received, and it just became a passion for me, and that's all I do now.
I must say, you saved our many patients' lives with now the drugs just totally missed my mind. It's the one that stops tremors.
It's one of the side effects of misoprostol is brain damage.
Yeah, it's been a good thing. You know, we can provide medications that vets haven't had access to, and it's nothing better than getting a photo of an animal that they're alive now and the owners are so grateful. It's very rewarding, which you guys know all about.
A quick one from the floor again, and you sort of touched on human compounding. The question is thoughts on veterinary compounding versus human compounding who has a veterinary training. What does that mean? And basically, what's the difference really?
Yeah, so I mean, at pharmacy school, we learn nothing about veterinary medicine. We learn nothing about veterinary specific compounding. So yes, there are differences. I mean, certain preservatives are, toxic to animals. Certain vehicles are dangerous to animals, but not to humans, vice versa. Certain flavors, obviously, are going to be really palatable to animals and not vice versa. So there are some differences. And there's also some key differences with regards to the legislation and what you're allowed to do as a compounder, as a human versus veterinary. So yeah, there is definitely a lot of difference between them. So I would definitely be someone who specialises in veterinary, or at least that's a good chunk of their business.
Great stuff. Marilyn wants to know, Sue, have you come across, so other than the trilostane example, specific drugs that reliably don't work when compounded? Like, are there things that we should avoid the compounding pharmacies for?
Well, no, but again, that comes back to the fact that trilostane is something that I have a window in to assess compounding, whereas almost any other drug, unless it were phenobarbital, cyclosporin, potassium bromide, etc., I can't look at blood levels. So for me, the whole compounding thing really revolved around how I could assess and see the wheels falling off with trilostane. And then I could only imagine how that was affecting numerous other drugs, because I've probably been guilty of doing what Gerardo's done every now and again, not with misoprostol, and like all vets, but also, in the old days, I just would have written a script for a compounding chemist and literally never thought twice about it for, maybe an immunosuppressive or an antibiotic that I couldn't get into the right dose for a cat particularly. And I just sort of assumed it would be okay. And it was only when I started doing the large volume adrenal function test. I mean, I probably look at about 5,000 or more tests a year, and suddenly you could see these patterns of things going wrong, which was almost like looking at blood levels, if you like. It's just an indirect way. And then I could only extrapolate. But that's the only real drug that I have, and ACTH, when that one company was doing the ACTH and doing it badly. They're the only drugs that I can perceive from my perspective,
okay,
and have any experience with.
I think probably the rise of trilostane as a popular compounded drug relates a lot to its cost and the fact that we want to adjust the dose all the time, because I remember how awkward it was as a vet when you needed to adjust doses, even when it was compounded, but in capsule form. It was the advent of the suspension was a big breakthrough just for case management ease.
Yeah, I agree. Capsules are just so difficult. I mean, if you're using 5 mg per kg of an antibiotic, well, you're going to use 5 mg per kg of an antibiotic. But trilostane the dose could be anywhere from 0.5 milligram per kilogram to 50 mg per kg, and it could change in that one animal. So having that flexibility, either with scored tablets or liquid, suddenly opened up a lot of people's eyes to the uses of a compounded drug.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions here. Just back to Nick again. There's one other great question here from Sally. So your comment that price and quality are usually at opposite ends of the spectrum. She wants to know, can anybody comment on how would you try to explain this to your clients who often want the cheapest? And the reason she asks is that we are told we can't tell a client where they must get their drug from because as a consumer, they have free choice.
I think here it's important to understand the distinction between compounding and licensed products. Like if you would go into Chemist Warehouse and you were to buy Panamax or paracetamol and you would go into a normal other pharmacy, a mum and dad pharmacy, and buy the same thing, you would pay more for exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. I think veterinarians think that when you go to a compounding pharmacy, if you go to one and pay more and then go to another and pay less, that you're getting the same thing, you're just getting it cheaper. You have to understand in the licensed products that these pharma companies have had to demonstrate to the regulator that a generic has the exact same efficacy and has exact same bioavailability in the target species. When we're talking about compounding, there is no external regulation for anyone to come and say, yes, that compounder, he's got the same formulation using the same raw materials as that one, and hence they should work the same. I can almost guarantee you they won't work the same because they're going to have different formulas, they're going to have different starting materials, and you just need to be aware of that. And so as a veterinarian, if you're going to switch from one compounder to another, you should be monitoring very closely because they are not using the same formulation. And so when it comes to being able to justify it, I think you can explain to the clients that there is no external regulation when it comes to compounding pharmacies. And as a prescriber, you have some responsibility when it comes to the medicine you're prescribing, or at least encouraging them to use. And you want to make sure for your own reputation that it's something that is going to work.
What are common concerns, given that you're one of the first veterinary compounding pharmacies in Australia? What were common questions that were brought up to you or that were asked to you that you had to answer, that you had to push through?
That kind of brings me, not many. And that's my point about, I don't think that many vets are actually going to get on the phone and ask their compounders these technical questions because you guys aren't trained in understanding, how to make quality medicines. It's just not something that you're trained to do. And so there aren't many questions that come. And so I've had to really take it upon myself to learn. I mean, setting up in the UK has been a huge help. Medicine standards in the UK are, the highest in the world, and we need to operate full GMP standards, which means all of that, those quality systems that we've learned have been able to implement into the Australian business. And unless you're exposed to that type of standard of medicine, you're not likely to know it. And that goes for compounding pharmacies as well as veterinarians.
Could I just ask one question? Because, over this 5 questions, and your knowledge is huge, but in a very simplistic fact, would one question just be, do you use GMP product in your compounding? Would that be a really good place to start for a veterinarian?
GMP raw materials, absolutely. So the problem is a lot of pharmacies will source from wholesalers or distributors, and they might not necessarily know where the raw material is actually made. So they will get a certificate of analysis that has their wholesaler's name on it. But if you actually follow the pharmacy guidelines and GMP standards, you're actually meant to go all the way back to where it was manufactured. And does that manufacturer hold a GMP license? And are they licensed to make that active? Ask your pharmacy that. Do you actually trace back to the originating manufacturer of the API, and are they GMP?
Right. Should we get into the legalities a little bit? Dale asked earlier on, what if something goes wrong? Let's say we prescribe a drug and it doesn't work, or it does harm in a worst case scenario. Who's actually liable? Is it the prescribing vet who recommended the compounder, or is it actually the pharmacist?
My opinion here is that if there was ever anything that went wrong, there'd be an investigation. Obviously, professional bodies are looking for negligence, so they'd look at things like, did you act professionally? Did you act in accordance with the guidelines? But ultimately, they would investigate. And if there was something wrong with the product, it was made incorrectly and the pharmacist has made an error, but it was used correctly, then I think it would fall onto the pharmacy's insurance policy. If it was made correctly and used incorrectly, then I think it would likely fall onto the veterinarian's insurance policy. But I think that's something to confirm with your insurer.
Okay.
So, Nick, and there's actually been a question from the audience as well that relates to something that I've been thinking about, and that is about the ability to use compounded pharmaceutical products off the shelf, even for emergency use. This is something we touched on earlier a little bit, but in particular, trazodone is a drug that is very popular, and it's something that you might need for 5 days or 10 days in an individual, and you have no warning. And the board has instructed us that each instance of compounding needs to be on a specific prescription. So, give us any comments on that and things you guys have discussed with other bodies.
Yeah, so there's a bit to this. Firstly, the ABA guidelines are very good when it comes to emergency use, and they go through state by state different legislation that applies, and they're quite clear that in most of the states that it is allowed. But if I could just give a little bit of background to the legislation here and explain where I think this confusion's come from. So human medicine, there is the Therapeutic Goods Act that governs it, and that's the TGA is the regulator. Their legislation, the exemption to not have a licensed product is that a prescription needs to be for a specific person, for a therapeutic application to that person. And then it also says not by wholesale. So that's in the legislation. So having emergency use is not an option for human medicine because it needs to be for a specific patient already identified. So emergency use human, not allowed. All of the guidelines that talk about it say it's not allowed. Veterinary, when you look at the Ag Vet Code, it defines what's a veterinary chemical product, and then it talks about the exempt ones. Now, exempt is any product
made on instruction
from a veterinarian by a pharmacist. It's exempt from needing to be registered. It doesn't talk about needing to be a specific patient. So therefore, from a federal level, there's no legislation prohibiting emergency use. But you do need to look at state legislation because state is about supply. And this is where the ABA guidelines are really good because it talks about the different states. But if you look at New South Wales, for instance, it actually has a section that talks about supply by written order as opposed to supply by prescription. Prescription, you need to have an identified owner. Supply by written order, no need for an animal or owner to be identified, except that the only thing that makes that viable is that it needs to be in an emergency. So the state legislation allows for it and provides for it. The federal legislation allows for it and provides for it for veterinary. So I'm not quite sure what the Vet Practitioners Board means by saying that you can't have compounded products on the shelf in an emergency. And the ABA obviously consider that it's okay. I know that the ABA set up a working group and they're trying to resolve this exact issue because they know that there is a need to hold certain compounded products on the shelf in an emergency. And hopefully they're going to be able to harmonise all of that and make it allowed for you. But at the moment, I know you guys are vets and you need to act in accordance with the vet practitioner guidelines. And until it's all clarified and hopefully the ABA resolves it, it is an issue.
Got to work. You just got to work. Hubert and I work animal emergency service, and everything's an emergency, mate. So that just solves that issue. Okay.
Well, somebody did actually ask. Sally asked, "What do they define as an emergency?" Does anybody know? Sue, in your questioning, did you come across the answer? Is it something that needs to be done in the next 12 hours, or does it have to be dying?
Well, again, I don't know. I would think ACTH for an Addisonian dog was a very serious emergency that needed diagnosing right now before you gave days of dexamethasone to a pancreatitis case or something. But, yeah, I'm not sure they made a difference. So I don't know that the definition of emergency even mattered.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, especially in Australia, it's very vague. I spent a chunk of my career in the UK where the laws around compounding were very clear. What were you allowed to sell a compounded product for and what was strictly not allowed. And you had that whole cascade of, well, first you had to do a veterinary registered and then blah, 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 blah. And then I came to Australia and everybody was just sort of laissez-faire about it. Just, well, we don't really know, just get whatever you want. And it's obviously not as laid back as that. Nick, what are the rules? What can we actually get, or what? Let's ask it this way: what should you not get a compounded drug for? Like, are you? And I know, for example, in the UK, you were never allowed to do it for price because you wanted a cheaper product. Is that allowed, for example, in Australia?
Yeah, so the cascade that you talk about is law in the UK, which means you have to use it. In Australia, it's just professional practice standards, and it's best practice to use licensed products, and you should always do that. But the problem is there's more licensed products being discontinued than there are adding. So the rules are you can use a compounded product or a licensed product. It's up to you. You need to have clinical justifications, and it shouldn't be about price. The AVA guidelines do go through that. They actually say that if the animal's going to die, that price can be a consideration. In the UK, that's not an option.
Okay, great. Okay, anything else from the floor? We have Dale said earlier on, he says we often have to change the trilostane dose between when it's ordered and when it's supplied to the client, but it's illegal to change the label or put one of our labels over the compounder label, over the Bova label in their case.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the correct thing to do, which is outrageous, is to write another prescription, which is clearly not practical and would never be done in practice. So I think you should be able to put a label, your own veterinary label. So the pharmacy label has to stay on there. That's the law. But you can put another dispensing label, is my understanding, especially if the dose has changed. I think that's very important that's done by the veterinarian.
The New South Wales Veterinary Practitioners Board guidelines state that we can't place a label or provide an additional label. I mean, yeah, let's just decide whether we're going to do that ourselves. I mean, I certainly do if I need to. But you could always provide an advice note, because that's your fallback. You know, if you want to give additional advice over and above what's on a label.
I think the problem about that, though, David, and this is one I see, and probably Gerardo sees, but if that animal ends up going to an emergency centre, for example, or a different vet, sometimes taken in by the son of the family because it's sick at night, who isn't the one giving the trilostane in the day, that becomes really problematic. And it was something I took up with the vet board, because quite a few submissions I have, especially from emergency practices, go, we're not really sure what dose of trilostane it's on. The owner couldn't tell us, and the label was from when it was first dispensed.
Well, the label was rubbed off because it was such a big bottle of trilostane. That's a really tricky one, because you just don't know what to do then. And then we end up saying, look, we have to do a full exam and we have to do bloods to really determine, because we can't make the call on recollections on, assumptions. So
2 more practical questions. I think they roll in together. One from Tony and one from Brett. Tony says, do practices order in the compounded medications on behalf of a client and then mark them up? Or do you just write a script and charge for a script fee? And then Brett wants to know, does the medication have to be sent to the owner or to the clinic?
So medications can be sent either to the owner or the clinic. That's up to the veterinarian to decide. I think it's very important that the veterinarian is involved in the counselling to the patient. I think the veterinarian plays an important role there. What was the other question?
Well, basically markup. Is it fine to get it sent to the clinic and then you dispense it at a markup like you would with other medications, or do you just charge a script fee?
It's a bit of a long answer to that one, I'm afraid. So supplying by wholesale is prohibited for human compounded medication. As I said in legislation, it's not prohibited for veterinary. However, when you look at the state-based legislation, to be able to supply for the purpose of resupply, from New South Wales at least, the medicine needs to be bought from a business that has a wholesale license. Mm-hmm. So if the pharmacy has a wholesale license, then the veterinarian is legally allowed to put a markup on it. If they don't, then it's meant to just be a dispensing fee or prescription fee, or however you wanted to do it.
Okay. So does Bova have a wholesale license?
Bova has applied for a wholesale license and is in communication with New South Wales Health about it.
Okay.
As I believe there's no restrictions to us having one, because there's no restrictions to marking up veterinary medicine. So I'm hopeful that New South Wales Health will give it to us. And we'll certainly be letting vets know if we have one.
Okay. Fantastic. I think that's the end of all the official questions, unless anybody else wants to jump off.
I've got one more question.
We are also running out of time, but Gerardo always has to have the last word.
This is a really deep and meaningful question. Nick, are you ready for this, mate? What am I going to mix my misoprostol with? So if I was going to mix my misoprostol with something, should I get olive oil, or should I get some tomato sauce from the cabinet, or is saline, or is it water?
But just so you know, we just bought a very expensive biological safety cabinet to handle our misoprostol orders, which means
So we can buy some compounded misoprostol, because no one wanted to touch that. No one wants to touch it. Okay, for people who are out there who don't use misoprostol, it's for non-steroidal overdoses, and we see them a lot, right?
It's also structurally similar to the abortion pill, which is something you need to be really worried about.
That's the reason why no one wants to touch it. And when a nurse goes, I don't want to touch that, I'm like,
It's like a pregnancy test. Like an in-house
so we need a
pregnancy.
plan in 9 months in advance. You know, so what's up? No. So we can order that I can order that from you now. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
I have another. This might be I want to have the last word, actually, Gerardo. One of our nurses is online tonight, and she told me to tell you that you should send better Chupa Chups with your orders, and nobody likes the lemon Chupa Chups.
Oh, that's the best.
Okay, so lemon Chupa Chups for all my staff from now on.
No more lemon to North Nara, please. Yeah.
Yeah, Nick, lemon Chupa Chups to your marketing director at Bover Australia. There we go.
Do you know that we get complaints if we get to put in Chupa Chups?
You should. My kids like them.
Love it.
Remember to head to thevetvault.com to get access to the show notes that includes all the references and all the resources mentioned in each episode. And if you feel like there are some aspects of your clinical knowledge that could do with a bit of polishing, and let's be honest, we all do, but you're tired of staring at a computer screen for another online course or webinar, then click on the clinical content button to access our clinical podcasts. 3 short and highly practical episodes per week in small animal medicine, surgery, and emergency and critical care, where we interview world-class specialists to get the nuggets of wisdom that you need to get up to speed with what's new and what's important.